Previously on After the Uprising.
Seals was found shot inside a burning car in Riverview on Diamond Drive.
I do know that there is a lot of sentiment in the community that they want justice, they want the truth.
You know, you still got a life that has a tab on it from your past endeavors. You know what I'm saying?
Man, I ain't never seen bruh sweat. It's like he wanted all the smoke.
He was killed during an argument. Where that argument took place at, no one really knows. You know what I'm saying? But he was killed during an argument.
Can you give me any sense of what the argument would have been over?
Music.
The guy who lived at that location, he told the two guys, y'all can't leave that body in front of my house.
I'm not going to let nothing or nobody change my mind because I already know who did it. The FBI did that to my son. They've been following him for months.
Don't shoot! Don't shoot!
What you're looking at is the aftermath of the grand jury deciding not to indict Officer.
29-year-old Darren Seals was murdered before his killer set his car on fire.
Once they put out the flames, they discovered Seals' body inside with a gunshot wound.
Pointed gun on me and my 14-year-old little brother, it's Ferguson PD. Grabbed me by my heart, slammed me out the car. He said you might want to pick your enemies better.
This is After the Uprising, Season 2, The Murder of Darren Seals.
I got a hold of our detective, and essentially the suspect we applied for warrants on is deceased.
This is Sergeant Tracy Panis of the St. Louis County Police again, and she's telling me something rather amazing. Apparently, at some point, they thought they knew who killed Darren, and they applied to get an arrest warrant for the suspect. But that person is now deceased. As getting an arrest warrant in a homicide case shouldn't take very long, we wanted to know when the suspect died.
No, I don't. I don't have a death day on him or anything. No, I don't.
According to Sergeant Panis, the St. Louis County Police had made their recommendation for prosecution to the county attorney's office. We asked why that never moved forward.
I would imagine it's related to them being deceased. Yeah. If the suspect is deceased, they're not going to do anything with it. I mean, I would assume not. I don't know. That might be a better question for them. On our end, it just shows taken under advisement, which is pretty normal for a case when they're waiting for more evidence or they're waiting for some more information on the case. You can check with them, but that's what we have, and my detective is not available to speak to the case, especially since we're still actively pursuing possible other suspects. So
Sergeant Panis said she couldn't give us the name of the suspect, but that we might be able to obtain it if we made a sunshine request to the prosecutor's office. So we did. And in the meantime, we began to dive into the FBI file on Darren that had been obtained through James Cooper's Freedom of Information Act request. As we mentioned in the last episode, the vast majority of the pages in the file are totally blacked out by redactions. So we sought help in deciphering what was available to be read.
So there's an FBI special agent, a U.S. deputy marshal, and what is probably a police sergeant who perform a vehicle stop on Darren Seals as he was driving his known 2012 Jeep Wrangler. Redaction. The vehicle was located in a parking lot in the area of redacted. Uniformed officers, redacted.
This is Mike German. He's a fellow with the Brennan Center for Justice's Liberty and National Security program. And before that, he served as the policy counsel for national security and privacy at the ACLU's legislative office. Rather interestingly, before working for the American Civil Liberties Union, Mike was an FBI special agent, which informs the book he authored, titled Disrupt, Discredit, and Divide: How the New FBI Damages Democracy. We sent him a copy of the FBI file on Darren. And here we're breaking down a section of the report that explains how the FBI arranged to have Darren pulled over with the help of local police and other authorities. Note, this is not the traffic stop from Ferguson that was filmed by a bystander that we played audio from earlier this season.
Uniformed officers who made the stop advised that Seals had active warrants for arrest. These appear to be traffic warrants, including driving with the license revoked, so they're basically putting the reasonable suspicion for why they can justify a car stop. What's clear from the rest of it is that they were using the car stop to try to search for a weapon. And when they don't find a weapon, they release him, which only reinforces that the purpose of the stop was not to enforce the warrants or penalize him for driving without a license.
Everything Mike just read about Darren being pulled over comes from a page in the report that was filed on June 8th, 2016, 3 months before Darren's death. Darren's FBI report is so heavily redacted that barely anything can be gleaned from it, and this description of the traffic stop is one of the few readable portions of the file. We asked Mike if he could make sense of the remaining bits of text, much of which is insider jargon, abbreviations, and reference codes.
So there are a couple of things. One is on the opening memo, the agent opening the case opens it based upon the allegations that Darren Seals was a self-described revolutionary who has espoused somewhat militant rhetoric and has access to weapons. Under the FBI's rules that are allegedly to protect First Amendment rights, an FBI agent is not allowed to open an investigation based solely on First Amendment activities. But this description reflects how easy that is to overcome.
And it strikes me that it's referenced over and over again, that allusion to this is not based on First Amendment, right? I see that many times in this document. It's one of the only unredacted statements.
And that's because that's the only protection. So that's the only hurdle that has to be overcome. And some of the documents are referencing what's called a CDC review. CDC is the Chief Division Counsel. That's an FBI agent lawyer who is in the office. This other FBI official who has a law degree is supposed to okay the investigation and the activity and review it every 6 months. There are indications that this is opened as a domestic terrorism investigation because of the CDC reviews. And because of this document, which is on page 23, the people at this traffic stop are an FBI special agent, a U.S. deputy marshal, and a police sergeant, in addition to the uniformed officers who are apparently making the stop. And that tells me that it's a task force. And I would imagine most likely that it's a joint terrorism task force, but it could also be a violent crimes task force or a drug task force, given Seals' previous conviction for drugs. But clearly a federal investigation that is utilizing their information that they have from informants or their own suppositions based on his criminal history.
One of the more frustrating things about how insanely redacted the FBI report is that we don't even know what kind of investigation it's describing. It would be easy enough to just assume that the FBI was looking into Darren as a potential domestic terrorist because of his highly visible status with the Ferguson movement. But we don't know that for sure. The FBI could have been investigating Darren for other reasons, such as potential gang or drug activity.
There's a reference to his one drug conviction, but it's interesting how they characterize that because they also reference a number of arrests that did not result in convictions, which is somewhat unusual that you would highlight arrests for assault, arrests for armed criminal action, unlawful use of a weapon when there was no conviction associated with that. What it appears to me just from these records is what they were trying to accomplish was what they call a disruption. Immediately after 9/11, Attorney General John Ashcroft resurrected this concept of disruption, this idea that if the FBI believes you did something bad and can't prove it, they're still going to take actions to disrupt your activities. And this is sometimes referred to as the Al Capone concept, that Al Capone was this murderous gang leader in Chicago, but they ended up convicting him of income tax evasion.
What are the tools in the toolbox of disruption in the modern FBI?
Selective prosecution, finding some minor thing that the FBI typically wouldn't investigate or charge, credit card fraud or food stamp frauds that are below the threshold that normally triggers an FBI investigation, but it's kind of like, aha, we can put them in jail for this and disrupt their activities. And, when the person you're looking at is actually Al Capone or somebody like him who is actually a gangland leader, and there's plenty of evidence to show that, you just can't get witnesses to testify, that might seem like a rational methodology. But when the FBI perceives somebody as dangerous because of their advocacy and throughout history, including recent events, we've seen that they tend to view social movements led by people of color as threatening to the nation's security, threatening to the status quo in a way that they don't see white militancy as the same kind of threat. So who they perceive as a terrorist is very biased. And then adopting methods that selectively prosecute them for crimes is in itself a biased activity because they're not actually engaging in terrorist activity.
What would be the next step potentially? Do you just prosecute and get a person like that out of what they consider, harm's way, or do you then try to flip that person and get them feeding you on, other people in the circle?
Well, both are considered legitimate tactics under the disruption strategy that's documented in a 2009 document called Baseline Collection Plan. So it could be finding some other unrelated charge like felony possession of a firearm and putting that person away for a period of time. And that's considered disrupting their criminal activities. In the case of domestic terrorism, their terrorist activities, when the reason for the suspicion is that their advocacy is somehow dangerous.
It's well known that the FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, employed disruption tactics against the civil rights movement and its leaders as part of their COINTELPRO program. For instance, they sent an anonymous letter to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., disparaging him and urging him on to some unspecified act, which Dr. King himself believed was to commit suicide. Also, the FBI was instrumental in the Chicago raid that resulted in the assassination of Fred Hampton Jr. But those FBI actions all occurred before the Church Committee in 1975. Chaired by Senator Frank Church, this massive investigation into abuses by the CIA, NSA, FBI, and IRS not only turned up illegal operations like the FBI's COINTELPRO and CIA's MK-Ultra, but it resulted in the creation of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. This new level of oversight was intended to rein in unethical, unconstitutional, and frankly, un-American behaviors of the intelligence agencies. Certainly, we could argue all day about how successful this oversight is, but what seems clear is that the modern FBI seems less inclined to kill, but rather incredibly intent on disrupting and arresting the individuals they target. A modern example after the break.
Now, back to the show.
How did you end up on the Denver story in particular of all the ones that you might have chosen in this area?
To explain that, I need to back up a little bit and just explain that, probably going back to 2009, I'd been looking into the FBI's use of informants and sting operations in the context of terrorism. And my criticism is that the Bureau would find kind of impressionable people who don't have access to terrorist organizations, don't have weapons on their own, and then they would provide them with the means and opportunity to commit some sort of bombing or similar terrorist-like crime. In some of these cases, the targets of these stings end up being mentally ill or financially desperate in a way that makes them vulnerable to an informant's instigation.
This is journalist Trevor Aronson. In 2023, he published a story in The Intercept about how the FBI paid a violent felon to infiltrate the racial justice movement that formed in Denver after the killing of George Floyd. As we've heard from St. Louis locals who participated in the Ferguson movement, there was a lot of suspicion that informants were mixed into the crowd. In such environments, it's easy to become paranoid. Stories like the one Trevor broke about Denver serve to show us that what some might call paranoia is sometimes not paranoia at all.
The unrest in 2020 happened, and that coming on the heels of the FBI defining Black identity extremism as a form of domestic terrorism, I really had this hunch that the FBI was using the same type of tactics against political activists. And I felt like it was a pretty good hunch and an educated guess, but I didn't have any proof. And so I spent a good year trying to find examples of this. There were all sorts of rumors that summer about government infiltrators and people who were acting suspicious, but there wasn't a lot of proof that these people were government infiltrators. And so in trying to find this proof that this was happening, I ended up getting leaked to me this cache of documents and recordings from Denver that prove that. So it wasn't like I just went out and picked Denver as the case study that I would pursue. It was more that Denver kind of found me through these leaked documents. And then I was able to go to Denver and report it out and kind of use Denver as a case study of what was likely happening nationwide.
What Trevor documents in his reporting is that the FBI paid a man named Mickey Windecker to infiltrate the movement in Denver. When Trevor asked Mickey to comment on working for the FBI, Mickey initially denied having done so. But Trevor had copies of payment receipts to the tune of $20,000 from the FBI to Mickey. And the FBI didn't just want Mickey to act as eyes and ears within the movement. They wanted him to goad an activist into committing a felony. Trevor notes that this focus on black social movements by federal law enforcement comes in the wake of the FBI's coining of the term black identity extremist.
The FBI was specifically investigating a number of black activists whose only reason for suspicion, as far as the FBI was concerned, was a result of their gun ownership. And you don't see that kind of investigative activity happening targeting white political activists or white people in general. And so I think you can point to a double standard. What makes it harder to kind of quantify, the FBI's efforts related to black identity extremism is that once black identity extremism as a label became public, it was met with criticism by people in the press, by people on Capitol Hill. And what the FBI did was publicly backtrack, essentially, right? They said that they no longer use the term black identity extremism and have instead created this new category under domestic terrorism called racially motivated violent extremism, which lumps together so-called black identity extremism with white supremacists and white nationalists and other kind of racially based extremism in the FBI's term. And so in that way, it becomes harder to quantify the efforts that the FBI makes specifically toward black identity extremism.
We explained to Trevor that before being murdered, Darren had expressed to his friends and family that he expected to be killed specifically by the FBI. And we asked if he thought that, in the post-Church Committee era, such an extrajudicial killing by the FBI was even reasonable to consider.
And, anything is possible. I guess I would be quite skeptical of that unless, faced with overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Is it possible that an agent acting on his own volition or an informant acting on his own volition killed someone like Darren Seals? Sure. I mean, it's possible. I think it's highly unlikely. I think it's even more unlikely that would in any way be condoned or ordered as an official part of business for the FBI. That a case agent or a supervisor was ordering such a thing. I mean, I think that's highly, highly unlikely. I would note that kind of on a more global level, that anyone who tends to be under surveillance by the FBI, generally ends up being somewhat paranoid about what's happening to them. And that's the nature of that, right? If you realize that you are under suspicion or under surveillance by the FBI, you may see an agent, but then you end up being at a coffee shop or a Walmart, a grocery store, and you see someone who looks like an agent in your mind, and they're not. And in your mind, they're oh, they must be an agent. And that's part of the process that the FBI has in providing surveillance on someone. It can be twofold. They may choose to surveil someone in a way that they are quite discreet, and that person may not know that they are under surveillance. But there's also a strategy that the FBI has of putting someone under surveillance in a way that they know they're under surveillance, to prevent them from the activism, to prevent them from doing crimes, just to see what they do when they're facing that suspicion. And so I think that kind of tactic used by the FBI, if it was used, is the type that breeds paranoia, where someone might say, if something happens to me, it's the FBI.
Mike German had suggested that the agents who were surveilling Seals may have opened their report based on information they received from an informant. Unfortunately, the FBI report couldn't give us any help in this area, again, because of its near total redaction. We asked Trevor what he knew about how close informants have been known to get with their targets.
There have been cases of allegations involving sexual relationships between informants and their targets, but that is pretty rare. It's more common that the informants have an intense personal relationship with the targets of their investigation than that they would be investigating that person from a distance. Just simply because you're obviously not going to get a whole lot of information about people if you're not close to them. And so the case with Mickey Windecker in Denver is more typically the case of an informant-led investigation, in that the informant not only becomes an integral part of the supposed conspiracy group, but then also develops very intense relationships with the targets of the investigation, right? In many terrorism investigations, for example, the informant almost plays this big brother, father-like role to the targets of the investigation. And so there's an inherent psychological element where there are feelings that, the person under investigation doesn't want to disappoint this person because this person has a brotherly role in their life. So much so that a federal judge had commented in one case that informants are by nature sociopaths, right? Because the job of an informant is to get to know someone over a period of weeks, months, if not years, and become an integral part of that person's life, knowing the entire time that you're going to send that person to prison for years, right? And so the ability to kind of do that kind of work takes a sociopathic personality. And I think that's true of a lot of informants. I think that's likely true of someone like Mickey Windecker in Denver.
Given Trevor's comments about the brotherly relationships utilized by FBI informants to ingratiate themselves with the target, we couldn't help but wonder if anyone in Darren's life might be working for the feds. Someone from the Ferguson movement or the hip-hop world, perhaps.
I tend to find FOIA to be a hindrance more than anything else, so I don't generally rely on it. The only way to do it well is to have a lawyer who's willing to get about for you on those cases.
Yeah, we noticed the activist who actually got, the only document related to the Darren Seals surveillance. He waited about 2 years for it, which would have meant that he put in the FOIA around September 2020. And we noticed that the document itself referenced that it had been declassified officially as of October 2020. So it made us wonder why they would have made him wait 2 years for a response on a document that they'd already just declassified at the time of his request.
Yeah, I mean, it's part of the system, right? It's intentional. It's like to make you wait. It's a good way to dissuade people from doing stories, right? Because by the time you get your documents, there's a good chance that you're no longer interested in the story that you finally got documents from. The FOIA system is broken, but it's not broken as far as the government is concerned.
More after the break.
Now, back to the show.
When was your last contact with the FBI?
Oh, I forgot the lady's name. She was very highly intelligent.
This is Darren's mother, Bonnie, again.
Was this the St. Louis FBI office that you went to see?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
When we got there, I told her, I said, my son was assassinated. Because I said it from day one, before these papers came out, the 900 sheets. And she said, no, she said, I don't believe that would happen. So I told her, I said, well, if you don't believe he was assassinated, why did it take 8 to 10 police cars to pull him over? And his license was suspended and they lock him up.
When you met with FBI, did they ever volunteer or reveal that your son was being surveilled for the 6 months before he died?
No.
That would have been nice of them to make clear at that point.
Bonnie believed that the FBI had killed her son before the 900-page report proving their surveillance had ever been made public. What we wanted to know is why the surveillance began when it did.
When I heard that there was this document that had come out, I assumed it was going to show that Darren Seals had been followed since the beginning of the Ferguson Mike Brown movement. So since maybe about, let's say, September of 2014, when he rose to prominence and he was very well known in 2015. Is there anything you make of this timing? Why did they start this thing on March 3rd, 2016, a year and a half or more into his known activities?
Hard to tell. Particularly, you got to keep in mind that if you look at the first page of what the FBI sent, there are a whole lot of pages that the FBI found regarding Darren Seals that are not disclosed. So there's a lot of activity that is still hidden. And this is one of the methods the FBI and the Justice Department use to subvert Freedom of Information Act requests is, and I'm not sure how this case proceeded, but typically the FBI either completely ignores or slow walks Freedom of Information Act requests. In many cases, the FBI will say, we don't have any records. And that could indicate one of two things. One, that they don't have records. Two, that they have records that they just haven't really searched very hard for because they only conduct a search of one database, the main files they're called. But now that the FBI has redefined itself as a domestic intelligence agency. It has many other huge databases, including one that has been called the Investigative Data Warehouse. Typically in litigation, there will be more arduous searches done if you get a judge who is interested in applying the FOIA law as written, but it's an expensive and time-consuming process. And I think part of the way they see it working is that because documents are released in dribs and drabs, it doesn't create a whole story.
In examining the FBI report, we've been tempted to guess which words or names might fit in certain blank spots. But Mike suggests that this is a fool's errand.
That's always fraught because, there's an old adage that you don't know what you don't know. And, particularly having done investigations, it's kind of risky to guess. There's exclusions and exceptions. The exclusions are what's written here on every document where there's a redaction, B7E, B7D. These are referencing the part of the statute that says they can hide certain types of information even as they turn over the documents. But there are also exceptions to the FOIA, which include things like informant files. And in the past, the FBI would say, we have no records, because the way they interpreted that exception was they didn't even have to acknowledge that those records existed, so they could provide a false no records reply to comply with the law. At the ACLU, we worked with the Justice Department during the Obama administration to point out that having the government lie on FOIA responses was not the best way that the government would enforce the spirit of the Freedom of Information Act law. So now what they do is when they send you a request, they will often just cite those exceptions and say, if there were records under these exceptions to the rule, we would not disclose them or acknowledge that we had them.
What's really interesting about what Mike is telling us, that in cases of records concerning an informant, the FBI will tell a requester that they cannot confirm or deny that they possess records on the individual, is that we made a FOIA request to the FBI that got this exact response. In early 2023, our producer, John Duffy, made a FOIA request to the FBI regarding someone in Darren's life. Eventually, Duffy was emailed a response to that request that had links to 3 PDF documents, and their file names were the same sort of strings of characters that Darren's FBI file consisted of. But when Duffy tried opening these links, they all resulted in a 404 error, like the linked PDF documents had been removed. After emailing a complaint to the FBI, asking that they fix the error, and waiting while they ignored him, Duffy eventually just resubmitted his exact same FOIA request, but this time he was sent a letter in the mail as a response. This letter said, quote, "You have requested records on one or more third-party individuals. Please be advised that the FBI will neither confirm nor deny the existence of such records pursuant to FOIA exemptions." And then they list the exemption codes. Duffy appealed this decision with the FBI's Office of Information Policy, explaining he had originally been emailed 3 defunct links to files. In July of 2023, the FBI granted his appeal and reopened his FOIA request, but 10 days later sent him another letter saying that they searched their central record system but found no documents. This whole affair is suspicious as hell, to say the least. The FBI emailing links to PDFs, then quickly pulling the linked files so they couldn't be accessed, then refusing to fix them, then pretending no files exist in their databases at all. Add in the fact that their letter uses the language Mike German says would be used in the case of an FBI informant, and it's hard not to suspect that the FBI is hiding something regarding the man in question. And who is that person who is the subject of our producer's wild FOIA goose chase? Anthony Irvin, better known by his street name, Kilo.
I just sent
you that email. So you've got my email, you've got my number.
Is included in those emails, does it include the dates that you got the initial recommendations from the police?
This is our producer, John Duffy, talking to Sherry Luter, a paralegal at the St. Louis County Prosecuting Attorney's Office. She called him back in response to his Sunshine request, seeking to know the name of the individual that the county police believed was responsible for killing Darren. He was driving when she called, so he had to quickly turn on a recording device, and that's why there's road noise in the background. He is asking her when exactly the police passed this name to the prosecutor's office.
I can tell you when. Let me get this case up here and look at it. It was November 2nd of 2018.
Okay.
And the prosecutor who was looking into this, who was going to be assigned this case, less than 2 months later, she left. So this was, this case never got issued. However, I do see Mr. Irvin is deceased, and I don't know when he passed away.
Mr. Irvin, again, was Darren's friend Kilo, and we'll continue to refer to him as Kilo to avoid confusion. Kilo was a member of the Bottom Boys, and Bonnie told us Darren had been on the phone with Kilo talking about a music video deal the day he died, and that it was Kilo he was going to see when he left his girlfriend Naomi at home making taco bowls, having told her that he would be right back. Kilo himself was murdered in 2020, which lines up with what the police said about their suspect being deceased.
He died in April of 2020.
Oh, okay. Okay. So this would have, obviously then this sat. And the prosecutor, like I said, the prosecutor that would have been handling this left. So, and then at that point, we had a change of administration here. And so anyway, basically this just kind of, and I can't explain why. I don't know. That's not my area.
After being told that Kilo died a year and a half after he was recommended for prosecution, Sherry doesn't know what to say. It seems she is weighing the gravity of the fact that his death was not what prevented the case from going forward, but that someone along the way dropped the ball.
I'm a journalist. I'm working on a story about Darren Seals' death. And we've been talking to a lot of people in his world, in the community, and on our own, we were able to come up with Anthony Irvin. The reason I sunshined the prosecutor's office was to get confirmation of that detail. But insofar as Darren's murder, there had to be multiple people involved to move his vehicle and to get away from the location, things like that.
Like, I don't see there's nothing on here. There's no co-defendant linked to this case. So I do not know. But I do know that my supervisor has actually looked at this. I know he got the police report. I know he's looking at this, or it's going to be looked at to see if there is a second person who we should be looking at.
Maybe it goes without saying that the idea that a team of journalists investigating a 7-year-old homicide would be what it takes for a prosecutor's office to examine their own cases is not ideal. But apparently, that's what had to happen.
Was there an official reason for holding off on prosecuting Anthony Irvin at the time? Was it because you needed more evidence?
I do not know. This is so old, and both of the attorneys that review this are gone.
Were they from the previous administration? Were they Bob McCullough's people, or were they Wesley Bell's people?
These were Bob's people.
Okay. When a prosecutor leaves the office, what's the official workflow to make sure that a case that's being processed, the ball doesn't get dropped?
Typically, the case, it will get reassigned to a different prosecutor.
So there's a prosecutor now who has this case. Did they just give it up because Mr. Irvin passed away, or?
I don't know where the disconnect here is. I don't know what happened. I don't know why it's that. Both people that touched this case are gone. And one of them was the prosecutor's supervisor. And she left also.
I mean, obviously, there's the unfortunate matter of a family who's like, oh, who killed my son, wanting the justice or wanting the closure and then not getting it. But there's the other issue here is that, in theory, had Anthony Irvin been arrested, he may himself not been murdered. If he had been arrested and brought to trial for killing Darren, he, in theory, could be alive and in prison right now. And that's a hypothetical, of course. But so that's just what I'm curious about, like, what happened in that year and a half period between it being suggested and him himself being killed. And I know you probably don't have those answers, but I'm just, that's just where my mind goes when you tell me this.
Yes, and I totally understand. Yeah, and I'm not sure. Well, I certainly don't have that answer, and I'm not sure anybody here does, honestly.
The detectives who investigated Darren's murder believed that his friend Kilo was responsible, strongly enough to suggest him to the county attorney's office for prosecution. Though no one in the hip-hop world ever told us specifically that they believed it was Kilo who killed Darren, the suggestion that the murder was related to music business deals and that Darren's killer had already himself been murdered were enough for us to suspect Kilo. The fact that Kilo was alive for a year and a half and walking the streets a free man after the police gave his name to the prosecutor's office as their prime suspect is not only unnerving, but odd. And still, there's the matter of not only who the other people involved in Darren's murder were, but who killed Kilo. Is it, as Tef Poe says, that Kilo was murdered in retribution for killing Darren? Was his death related to Darren's at all, or is that just a rumor? That's next time on After the Uprising. After the Uprising is a production of Double Asterisk and iHeart Podcasts in association with True Stories. Season 2 was written, reported, and produced by Maria Chappelle Nadal, John Duffy, Mallory Kenoy, and Ray Novoselsky. Executive producers are Nikki Attore and Lindsay Hoffman for iHeart Podcasts, John Duffy and Ray Novoselsky for Double Asterisk, David Cassidy and Ruth Vaca for True Stories. Directed by John Duffy and Ray Novoselsky. Theme song and score by Zachary Walter. Sound engineering and mix by John Autry. Fact-checking by Muffin Humes. Marketing by Allison Cantor. Fair Use Legal by Peter Yazzie and Brandon Butler. Legal by Holly DeCann for iHeart Podcasts and Keith Sklar for Double Asterisk. Missouri Sunshine Legal by David Rowland. Show logo by iHeart Podcasts using a photo by Attilio D'Agostino. Our interns were Hannah Madura and Rosemary Feary. Website by Stephanie Clark. Recorded at David Weber's Airtime Studios in Bloomington, Indiana. We want to acknowledge additional investigation that became part of this podcast was conducted by Detective Adams in the St. Louis County Police and the FBI, who did not participate in this podcast, and by Amir Brandy, Mosi Secret, and Darnell Singleton. If you like our work, check out our other podcasts. You can find us at doubleasteriskmedia.com and on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Support us on Patreon. If you're enjoying the show, leave us a rating and review on your favorite podcast app. Thank you to Jamie Dennis, Danny Gonzalez, Jonathan Hartwig, Beth Ann Macaluso, Matt McDonough, Melissa McInnes, Ryan Mears, Tony and Val Novoselsky, and the family and loved ones of Darren Seals. Bottom Boys and DOA tracks used via fair use. So was the news reporting archival. Copyright 2024 Double Asterisk Inc.